There's a name that almost never appears in history books. A name that was present, recorded, documented, written into official logs, and then, slowly, quietly, began to disappear. Not from public life, not from the official record in any dramatic or sudden way, but from something harder to define, from memory itself, from the kind of attention that history naturally gives to the people who shaped it. His name was Senator Gerald Parr, and the more closely one examines his final months in office, the more a certain uncomfortable feeling begins to take shape. Not the feeling that something terrible happened, though it may have, but the feeling that something important was left unexplained, and that the explanation, if it exists at all, has not been easy to find. Senator Parr served for years. He was present. He attended important meetings, participated in significant discussions, and held a position that carried real weight. That much is clear from what records do exist. He was not a minor figure operating at the edges of relevance. He was a sitting senator, a person whose movements, decisions, and activities should have been well documented, and for most of his career they were. This raises a question that is worth sitting with for a moment. Why does someone like that, someone documented, present, and accounted for, eventually become so difficult to trace? He did not resign. That is one of the first things worth noting. In most cases where a political figure disappears from the record, there is a moment of departure, a resignation letter, a public statement, a vote that was not attended, followed by an explanation. Senator Parr had none of that. He was not voted out. He was not removed. There was no public break, no visible moment where his presence simply ended. He was there, and then gradually, he was not. And the transition between those two states is precisely where the record becomes difficult to follow. At first, it seems like a simple matter of administrative gaps. Records from that period are not always perfectly preserved. Files go missing. Documents are misfiled, lost in transitions between offices, or simply never properly cataloged. This is not unusual in historical research, but here's where it becomes unclear. The gaps around Senator Parr are not random. They are not scattered evenly across his career. They are concentrated, specifically concentrated around his final months in office. That pattern is harder to explain away as simple record-keeping failure. In those final months, something changed in how Senator Parr was spending his time. He began making private appointments, not the kind of public-facing meetings that appear in official schedules. Private appointments, arranged quietly, outside of the usual channels. Who those appointments were with has not been fully established. Some sources suggest they were with individuals connected to government archives. Others indicate a broader circle of contacts. But the details are incomplete, and incomplete details are themselves a kind of information. They tell us that something was happening that was not meant to be easily traced. He also requested access to sealed government files. This is perhaps one of the more concrete details available from that period, and it is worth pausing on. A sitting senator requesting access to sealed files is not, by itself, remarkable. Senators sometimes have reasons to review restricted materials, but the nature of what Parr requested, and whether he was granted access, and what he found if he was, remains unclear. The requests are documented. The outcomes are not. That gap between the documented request and the undocumented outcome is exactly the kind of detail that makes this case difficult to close. He also wrote letters, a number of them, in the final weeks before his death. Some of those letters were never delivered, not returned, not refused, simply never delivered, in ways that have not been clearly explained. Others cannot be located at all today. They were written, referenced in other documents, and then vanished. The letters themselves may have contained nothing significant. That is possible, but it is also possible that they contained something that someone did not want received. And without the letters, it is genuinely difficult to know which of those possibilities is closer to the truth. And then Senator Gerald Parr died, officially, from natural causes. He was not young, and his health had not been described as strong in his final months. On the surface, this is not a suspicious detail. People die. Senators die. Natural causes are a common end for men who have spent decades in demanding positions. But here is where the timeline becomes somewhat harder to accept without questions. The death came shortly after the private appointments, after the requests for sealed files, after the undelivered and missing letters. That sequence does not prove anything. But it is a sequence, and sequences matter when trying to understand what happened. The death was quiet. There was no significant public notice. For a sitting senator, or a recently sitting senator, the absence of public attention following his death is itself worth examining. Political figures of that standing typically receive some degree of formal acknowledgement when they die. Colleagues speak. Institutions issue statements. The record reflects the loss of someone who was part of the process. With Senator Parr, that acknowledgement was minimal. Some believe this simply reflects how far he had already faded from public view before his death. Others disagree. They suggest that the quietness was not accidental. This is where the question becomes more focused. What was Senator Parr looking for? That is the simplest way to frame what is being asked here. A sitting senator, in the final weeks of his life, was making private arrangements, seeking access to restricted materials, and writing letters that either never arrived or have since disappeared. Something was driving that activity, something he believed was important enough to pursue quietly, through channels that left fewer traces. The question of what that something was has not been answered, and it is not answered simply because no one looked. People have looked. The answer has not emerged in any clear or verifiable form. There's also the matter of what is not in the record. Historical silence is sometimes more informative than documentation. When a figure of genuine importance leaves almost no trace around a specific period of time, it raises the possibility that the absence was created, not simply allowed to develop. That is a difficult thing to prove. It is also a difficult thing to dismiss entirely when the pattern is as consistent as it appears to be in this case. The missing records, the undelivered letters, the private meetings with no surviving documentation. Each of these, individually, might be explained. Together, they form a shape that does not fully make sense. It is also worth noting what Senator Parr's colleagues said at the time, or rather, what they did not say. There are very few public statements from that period in which other members of the Senate addressed Parr directly, commented on his activities, or responded in any documented way to whatever it was he was pursuing. This silence among colleagues is not, on its own, evidence of anything. People in political environments do not always speak openly about what they know or observe, but the consistency of that silence, the way no one seemed to publicly acknowledge what Parr was doing, adds another layer to an already complicated picture. There are also questions about timing that have not been clearly resolved. The sealed files Parr requested access to, when were they sealed? What was the reason given for their classification? Were others making similar requests around the same time? And if so, what happened to their inquiries? These details matter because they help establish whether Parr was operating alone in his curiosity, or whether he was part of a broader pattern of individuals trying to access the same kind of information. The answers to these questions, if they exist somewhere in a properly preserved archive, have not made their way into the accessible record. What makes this case particularly difficult to set aside is its ordinariness. Senator Gerald Parr was not a flamboyant figure. He was not someone who publicly accused powerful people of wrongdoing, or who made dramatic statements that attracted lasting attention. He was, by most accounts, a quiet presence in his political environment, someone who did his work without drawing unusual notice. And that is precisely what makes his final months so unusual by comparison. The quiet urgency of what he was doing, the private appointments, the sealed file requests, the undelivered letters, does not match the profile of the man as he had been understood. Something changed his behavior in those final weeks, and whatever changed it has not been satisfactorily explained. Some who have examined this case suggest that Parr had come across information through the normal course of his work, through a contact, through something he read or was told, that changed his understanding of something significant, that he was, in those final weeks, trying to verify or expand on that information before deciding what to do with it. This is a reasonable hypothesis. It fits the pattern of behavior, but it remains a hypothesis because the information itself, if it existed, has not surfaced, and the people who might have known what he was looking for are either no longer living or have not spoken publicly about it. What remains, then, is a series of questions without answers. A senator who was present and then not present. a record that thins out precisely when it should be most detailed, a death that was quiet in ways that do not quite fit the circumstances, letters that never arrived, files that were requested and then not discussed, a pattern that does not resolve into a clear explanation no matter how many times it is examined. That detail sounds minor, perhaps, when any single element is considered alone, until each element is placed beside the others, and the shape they form together is examined closely. Then it becomes something more difficult to explain away. And the question of what Senator Gerald Parr was looking for, urgently, quietly, in the final weeks of his life, remains, for now, without a clear answer. The official record describes Gerald Parr as an unremarkable senator. That is not an insult. It is simply how the documentation reads. He served 2 terms. He attended meetings. He sat on committees that were important but not high profile. He made public statements that were careful, measured, and unlikely to attract controversy. By the standards of the political world he operated in, he was a steady, unspectacular presence, someone who did the work without drawing the kind of attention that tends to follow a person into the historical record. And yet here we are, examining that record closely, because something about the way it is structured does not sit entirely still under examination. The official version of Gerald Parr's life and death is clean, almost unusually clean. And clean timelines, when they appear in cases like this, sometimes deserve a second look, not because cleanliness is automatically suspicious, but because the absence of complexity, in a situation that contains several genuinely complex elements, is itself worth questioning. Gerald Parr died in the spring of 1961. He was 63 years old. The cause of death listed on his death certificate was cardiac failure. That is a common cause of death. It was common then, and it remains common now. A man in his early 60s, working in a stressful environment, dying of heart failure is not, on its own, a detail that demands investigation. It fits within a recognizable pattern. The body fails. The heart gives out. The record reflects this and moves on. That is how most such cases are handled, and in most such cases, that handling is entirely appropriate. His doctors, according to what is available, described no unusual illness in the period leading up to his death, no documented deterioration that would have been surprising given his age and circumstances, no extended hospital stays, no public references to serious health concerns. His colleagues offered brief condolences after his passing. The press gave him 2 or 3 short notices, the kind of coverage that acknowledges someone's existence and service without lingering on either. Within a short period of time, the public record moved on entirely. This raises a question that is worth holding for a moment. For a man who served 2 terms in the United States Senate, a position of genuine institutional weight, why was the response to his death so minimal? Brief condolences and a few short notices is a thin acknowledgement for someone who participated in the business of government for that length of time. Some would say this reflects his reputation as an unremarkable figure. If a senator is not known for dramatic legislation, public conflict, or memorable statements, then the response to his death might simply mirror the quietness of his career. That is a reasonable explanation. It is the kind of explanation that, on the surface, makes sense, but it doesn't fully account for the degree of silence that surrounded Parr's passing. Unremarkable senators still receive institutional acknowledgement. Their deaths are noted in official records, discussed in committee rooms, mentioned in floor proceedings. The absence of that kind of acknowledgement in Parr's case goes slightly beyond what his quiet reputation would naturally explain. His personal papers were transferred to a regional archive following his death. This is standard procedure. When a senator dies, the materials from his office, correspondence, notes, working documents, records of meetings and appointments, are typically collected and moved to an appropriate repository. Some of those materials are made available to researchers relatively quickly. Others are restricted, sometimes for years or decades, depending on their content and the classifications attached to them. In Parr's case, some of his papers were made available. Others were marked as restricted. The archive noted this as standard procedure for government-connected documents of that era, and that explanation may be entirely accurate. Restriction is common. It is not automatically suspicious. But here is where it becomes unclear. the specific papers that were restricted, their subject matter, the reason for their classification, the timeline for their eventual release. These details are not easy to establish from the available record. Restricted documents typically come with some form of documentation explaining why the restriction was applied. In many cases, that documentation is itself accessible even when the underlying materials are not. With PARS papers, the documentation around the restrictions is not clearly preserved or easily located. That is a small detail, but small details sometimes carry weight when they appear alongside other small details that individually mean little and collectively mean something harder to ignore. PARS family made no public statements suggesting anything unusual. This is noted in the record, and it is worth taking seriously. Families are often the first to raise concerns when something does not feel right about the circumstances surrounding a death. They are close to the individual. They are aware of his state of mind in his final weeks. If something had been visibly wrong, visibly frightening, or visibly out of the ordinary, the family might reasonably be expected to say something, even in a restrained way. They did not, and that silence could mean several things. It could mean there was nothing unusual to report. It could mean the family had no information that would have led them to ask public questions. Or it could mean something else. The silence does not resolve into a single clear meaning. No formal investigations were opened following his death. No colleagues came forward publicly with concerns. The institutions that surrounded Gerald Parr, the Senate, the committees he sat on, the archive that received his papers, none of them indicated, in any publicly accessible form, that anything about his death or the circumstances preceding it required further examination. At first, this seems to confirm the official account. If the people closest to the situation saw nothing worth investigating, perhaps there was nothing worth investigating. But there's a problem with that reasoning. The absence of investigation does not prove the absence of concern. It proves only that no investigation was formally opened. Those are different things. It is worth thinking carefully about the environment in which Gerald Parr operated. The early 1960s were a complicated period in American political life. There were pressures and tensions operating at multiple levels of the government. Information was carefully managed in ways that were not always transparent. Certain things were discussed privately that were never acknowledged publicly. Certain concerns were handled through informal channels rather than formal ones. A senator who was quietly pursuing something in that environment, requesting sealed files, making private appointments, writing letters that never arrived, would have been operating in a context where the absence of official response did not necessarily mean the absence of awareness. It is possible that people knew. It is possible that the institutional silence was not passive, but deliberate. That is not a certainty, but it is a possibility that the clean official record does not eliminate. The timeline is described as clean, and that word is worth examining more carefully. A clean timeline, in historical terms, means one where the documented events connect smoothly, without visible gaps or contradictions. Birth, career, committees, death, archive. Each step leads logically to the next. Nothing appears out of order. Nothing demands an explanation that the record fails to provide. But a clean timeline can be the result of two very different things. It can mean that the events genuinely unfolded simply and without complication. Or it can mean that the record was shaped, through omission, restriction, or careful management, to present a simpler picture than the underlying reality. The timeline itself cannot tell you which of those possibilities applies. You have to look at what surrounds it. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. When the surrounding context of Parr's final weeks is examined, the private appointments, the requests for sealed files, the undelivered and missing letters, the clean timeline of the official record stops looking like a natural reflection of simple events. It starts looking like a surface, smooth on top, but not obviously connected to whatever was happening underneath. A death certificate that lists cardiac failure is not falsified simply because the person who died was engaged in unusual activity in the weeks before dying. That needs to be clearly stated. But the combination of circumstances does raise questions about whether the full picture of Gerald Parr's final period has been captured in the documentation that remains. There's also the matter of what researchers have found, or more precisely, what they have not found, when examining the available archive materials. Those who have gone looking for a clearer picture of Par's final months report a consistent experience. The materials that exist are surface level. They reflect the public, institutional version of his career without offering much visibility into the private, informal layer of his activities. Letters he is known to have written are not present. Meeting records that should exist, based on references in other documents, cannot be located. The archive is not empty, but it is incomplete in ways that follow a recognizable pattern. The gaps are not random. They tend to appear around the same period and the same types of activity. The death certificate itself has been reviewed. Cardiac failure. 63 years old. Spring of 1961. The document is properly formatted, properly signed, unremarkable in its presentation. Nothing about it appears unusual when it is examined in isolation. That detail sounds minor until it is considered alongside the broader question of what Gerald Parr was doing in the weeks before that certificate was completed. A death certificate is a record of a final outcome. It does not contain the weeks preceding it. It does not record what a person was searching for, who they were meeting with, or what letters they wrote that were never received. It records only the end, and the end, in this case, is the least complicated part of the story. What is more complicated is the gap between the public version of Gerald Parr, unremarkable, steady, uncontroversial, and the private version that emerges from the fragments of his final weeks. These two versions of the same person do not fit together in a way that is easy to explain. A man described as careful and measured does not typically begin making urgent private arrangements without a reason. A man with no known history of dramatic action does not suddenly pursue sealed government files without something motivating that pursuit. The official record does not offer a bridge between these two versions. It simply presents the first and omits the second, and that omission is exactly where the first real problem with the clean timeline appears. Not at the end, not in the death certificate, but in the space between what the record shows and what the remaining evidence suggests was actually happening. If Gerald Parr's death was as unremarkable as the official record suggests, then the weeks leading up to it should also be unremarkable. That is a reasonable expectation. A senator in the final stretch of his career, with no known controversies and no documented conflicts, should leave behind a record that reflects exactly that. Routine meetings, scheduled administrative tasks, the quiet, organized slowdown of a political life approaching its natural end. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual, nothing that would require explanation years later. But the calendar entries that do survive from early 1961 tell a slightly different story. Not a dramatically different story. Not one filled with obvious signs of crisis or conflict, but different enough that the gap between what those entries show and what the official version implies becomes difficult to ignore. A small number of documents from that period have been examined by researchers over the years. What they found was not nothing, and what they found does not match the profile of a senator quietly winding down. It is worth pausing on what a senator's final weeks typically look like, at least from a documentary standpoint. Most senators approaching the end of their tenure, whether through retirement, electoral loss, or declining health, leave behind records that reflect a gradual reduction in formal activity. Fewer new initiatives, fewer cross-departmental contacts, a narrowing of focus toward the work already in progress and the committees already assigned. The paper trail gets thinner, but in predictable ways. It thins in the directions you would expect. What it does not typically do is shift direction entirely in the final weeks, moving toward departments and areas that have no connection to the senator's existing work. That is what makes the surviving calendar entries from early 1961 worth examining. In a span of roughly 6 weeks, Senator Gerald Parr made 3 separate requests for briefings from departments he had no direct committee connection to. 3 requests. 6 weeks. For a senator described as quiet and unremarkable, operating in the final stretch of his career, this is not a pattern that fits the official narrative. It is not impossible. Senators do occasionally reach beyond their assigned committee areas, but the circumstances around these particular requests raise questions that have not been clearly resolved. The first request involved records from a federal communications office. The specific nature of what Parr was seeking from that office is not clearly documented. What is documented is that he made the request. A senator whose committee work had no established connection to federal communications reaching out to that office in early 1961 is a detail that invites a follow-up question. What was he looking for? Was it related to something he had encountered through other channels? Was it part of a broader inquiry he was conducting privately? The request is in the record. The reason behind it is not. The second request was directed toward a security-related division. This is where the documentation becomes more complicated and more difficult to work with. The name of the division itself appears redacted in the surviving paperwork. That redaction is significant for a specific reason. It means that even the identity of the department PAR was attempting to contact has been obscured in the materials that remain. You can see that a request was made. You can see PAR's name attached to it. But the destination of that request, the specific security-adjacent entity he was reaching toward, has been removed from the accessible version of the document. That is not standard archival practice for routine administrative correspondence. It suggests that someone, at some point, determined that even the name of that division warranted protection. There was a third request as well. The details around it are thinner than the first two, which is itself an observation worth making. The least documented of the three requests is the one that is hardest to place in any recognizable context. What is known is that it existed. What is not known is where it was directed, what it concerned, or whether it received any kind of formal response. 3 requests in 6 weeks, from departments outside PAR's committee area, with documentation that is either incomplete, redacted, or simply absent. That pattern is difficult to explain through ordinary administrative logic. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Senators, as a general rule, work within defined institutional structures. Their committee assignments are not arbitrary. They reflect areas of focus, established relationships with relevant government departments, and accumulated expertise in specific policy domains. When a senator reaches outside those structures, especially toward security-adjacent areas of government, there is typically a reason recorded somewhere. A formal justification, a documented conversation with a colleague that prompted the inquiry, a specific legislative concern that required cross-departmental information. These things leave traces. The trace might be small, but it is usually there. In PAR's case, no justification is recorded for any of the 3 requests. Not for the Communications Office inquiry, not for the redacted Security Division contact, not for the third request whose destination remains unclear. There is no memo explaining the rationale, no documented conversation that would suggest where the impulse for these inquiries originated. The requests exist in the record as isolated facts, present, but unconnected to any visible chain of reasoning. At first, this might seem like a minor administrative gap, but there is a problem with accepting that explanation here. 3 separate requests, all made within the same 6-week window, all directed outside the senator's normal area of operation, all lacking documented justification. That is not one administrative gap. It is a pattern of gaps. In 2 of the 3 cases, there is also no record that the requests were formally responded to. This detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Government departments do not typically ignore formal inquiries from sitting senators. Even if the answer to a request is a denial, that denial is usually documented. A letter confirming receipt, a memo explaining that the requested information is restricted, a formal acknowledgement that the inquiry was received and processed. These are the kinds of responses that institutional procedures are designed to generate. The absence of a response in the formal documentary record is therefore unusual. It could mean the response was given informally, through a conversation or a meeting that was not committed to paper. It could mean the request never reached its intended destination. Or it could mean something else. The silence where response should be does not explain itself. Some researchers who have looked at this material suggest that PAR may have been operating through informal channels alongside the formal requests, that the documented inquiries represent only a portion of what he was actually pursuing during those 6 weeks. This is consistent with what is known about his private appointments during the same period. A man making formal requests through official channels while simultaneously conducting private meetings and writing letters outside of normal communication structures suggests someone who was aware that the formal channel alone might not get him what he needed. Whether that awareness came from prior experience, from a specific conversation, or from something he had already discovered, is not recorded anywhere that has been found. It is also worth considering what the early months of 1961 represented in terms of the broader political environment. This was a period of significant institutional activity in Washington. A new administration had just taken office. Departments were being reorganized. Priorities were shifting. In that kind of environment, certain kinds of information become more sensitive, and certain kinds of inquiries attract more attention than they might have in quieter periods. A senator reaching towards security-related divisions during a moment of institutional transition would not have gone unnoticed. Whether that attention had any connection to the subsequent thinness of the documentary record around Parr's requests is a question that cannot be answered from the available materials. But it is a question worth holding. The redaction in the second request is a specific detail that deserves its own consideration, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Senators, as a general rule, work within defined institutional structures. Their committee assignments are not arbitrary. They reflect areas of focus, established relationships with relevant government departments, and accumulated expertise in specific policy domains. When a senator reaches outside those structures, especially toward security-adjacent areas of government, there is typically a reason recorded somewhere, a formal justification, a documented conversation with a colleague that prompted the inquiry, a specific legislative concern that required cross-departmental information. These things leave traces. The trace might be small, but it is usually there. In Parr's case, no justification is recorded for any of the three requests. Not for the Communications Office inquiry, not for the redacted Security Division contact, not for the third request whose destination remains unclear. There's no memo explaining the rationale, no documented conversation that would suggest where the impulse for these inquiries originated. The requests exist in the record as isolated facts, present, but unconnected to any visible chain of reasoning. At first, this might seem like a minor administrative gap, but there is a problem with accepting that explanation here. Three separate requests, all made within the same 6-week window, all directed outside the senator's normal area of operation, all lacking documented justification. That is not one administrative gap. It is a pattern of gaps. In 2 of the 3 cases, there is also no record that the requests were formally responded to. This detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Government departments do not typically ignore formal inquiries from sitting senators. Even if the answer to a request is a denial, that denial is usually documented. A letter confirming receipt, a memo explaining that the requested information is restricted, a formal acknowledgement that the inquiry was received and processed. These are the kinds of responses that institutional procedures are designed to generate. The absence of a response in the formal documentary record is therefore unusual. It could mean the response was given informally, through a conversation or a meeting that was not committed to paper. It could mean the request never reached its intended destination, or it could mean something else. The silence where response should be does not explain itself. Some researchers who have looked at this material suggest that Parr may have been operating through informal channels alongside the formal requests, that the documented inquiries represent only a portion of what he was actually pursuing during those 6 weeks. This is consistent with what is known about his private appointments during the same period. A man making formal requests through official channels while simultaneously conducting private meetings and writing letters outside of normal communication structures suggests someone who was aware that the formal channel alone might not get him what he needed. Whether that awareness came from prior experience, from a specific conversation, or from something he had already discovered, is not recorded anywhere that has been found. It is also worth considering what the early months of 1961 represented in terms of the broader political environment. This was a period of significant institutional activity in Washington. A new administration had just taken office. Departments were being reorganized. Priorities were shifting. In that kind of environment, certain kinds of information become more sensitive, and certain kinds of inquiries attract more attention than they might have in quieter periods. A senator reaching towards security-related divisions during a moment of institutional transition would not have gone unnoticed. Whether that attention had any connection to the subsequent thinness of the documentary record around Parr's requests is a question that cannot be answered from the available materials. But it is a question worth holding. Redactions and archival documents from that era are not rare. Many government records from the late 1950s and early 1960s contain redacted portions, reflecting classification decisions made at various points in the intervening decades. But a redaction that removes the name of a department, rather than specific operational details or names of individuals, is slightly less common. It suggests that the identity of the entity Parr was contacting was itself considered sensitive enough to obscure. That is a specific kind of sensitivity, and it raises a specific kind of question. What kind of division, within the government of that period, would have its name removed from a document recording a senator's inquiry? The surviving calendar entries do not provide an answer to that question. They provide a window into a 6-week period during which a quiet, unremarkable senator was doing things that did not match his established profile. 3 briefing requests. Departments outside his committee area. No recorded justification. No formal responses in 2 of the 3 cases. A redacted name where a department's identity should appear. Each of these details, taken alone, can be individually explained or set aside. Taken together, they describe something that does not sit comfortably within the official narrative of a senator who was simply winding down. However, the timeline does not fully match the image of gradual institutional withdrawal that the official version implies. A man who is quietly concluding his career does not typically accelerate his outreach in new directions during his final weeks. He does not reach toward security-related divisions with no documented connection to his existing work. He does not generate 3 separate unexplained requests within a single 6-week window. He does not leave behind a pattern of inquiries that are either unanswered, undocumented, or redacted. These are not the footprints of a quiet ending. They are the footprints of something being actively pursued. Something that was, for reasons still not clearly established, important enough to pursue urgently, and uncomfortable enough, apparently, that the documentation surrounding it remains incomplete to this day. Why these departments? That question has not been answered. Why these specific weeks, so close to the end of his life? That has not been answered either. And why is the documentary record around these requests so consistently thin? Some would say it reflects the routine imperfections of historical archiving from that period. Others disagree. They point to the consistency of the gaps, how they cluster around a specific person, a specific period, and a specific type of inquiry, and suggest that consistency is harder to attribute to chance than to intention. What is clear is that the calendar entries from early 1961 do not support the picture of an unremarkable senator in an unremarkable final chapter. They suggest something else was happening, and what that something was remains, for the moment, an open question without a satisfying answer in the available record. If the final weeks of Gerald Parr's life were truly ordinary, then the documents from that period should reflect that ordinariness. That is not an unreasonable expectation. A senator in the closing phase of his career, carrying no known controversies and no documented disputes, should leave behind a paper trail that confirms exactly what the official version claims. Scheduled meetings with familiar contacts, administrative tasks connected to his existing committee work, a gradual and predictable reduction in activity. Nothing that would require a researcher, decades later, to sit with a document and ask why it exists in the form it does. That expectation, however, does not hold when the surviving materials from early 1961 are examined carefully. What those materials show is not a dramatic departure from normal behavior. It is something quieter than that, and in some ways more difficult to explain precisely because of its quietness. The activity recorded in those weeks does not look like crisis. It does not look like panic. It looks like a man who was methodically pursuing something, deliberately, without drawing unnecessary attention. And that deliberateness is what makes the surviving calendar entries from that period worth examining in detail. To understand why those entries matter, it helps to first understand what a senator's documentary record normally looks like during a period of institutional wind-down. Most senators, as they approach the end of their time in office, leave behind records that narrow in focus. Their correspondence shifts toward existing relationships rather than new contacts. Their meeting schedules reflect the committees they already sit on, the colleagues they already work with, the departments that already fall within their assigned areas of responsibility. The paper trail does not stop, but it becomes more concentrated, more predictable, and more clearly connected to work that was already in progress. It does not, under ordinary circumstances, begin moving in new directions during those final weeks. But this is where it becomes unclear, because what the calendar entries from early 1961 actually show is movement in new directions, not gradual drift, and not the kind of broad institutional networking that some senior senators engage in toward the end of long careers. Something more specific than that. In a span of roughly 6 weeks, Gerald Parr made 3 separate requests for briefings from departments he had no established committee connection to. 3 requests. 6 weeks. For a senator whose career had been defined by careful, measured, unremarkable activity, this concentration of outward-reaching inquiries in a very short window of time is not easy to fit into the official narrative of a quiet ending. The first of those requests involved records from a federal communications office. The precise nature of what Parr was seeking from that office has not been established with any clarity in the available record. What is documented is the request itself, the fact that it was made, the period during which it was made, and the name attached to it. A senator whose committee work had no documented connection to federal communications reaching toward that office in early 1961 raises an immediate question. What was he trying to find? Was it something he had encountered through a separate line of inquiry? Was it connected to the other requests he was making during the same period? The request is present in the record. The reasoning behind it is not. The second request is more difficult to work with, for a specific reason. It was directed toward a security-related division, and the name of that division, in the surviving paperwork, appears redacted. That single fact carries more weight than it might initially seem to. Redactions in archival documents from that era are not uncommon. They appear regularly in materials from the late 1950s and early 1960s, reflecting classification decisions made at various points over the intervening decades. But most redactions target specific sensitive details, the names of individuals, descriptions of particular operations, references to specific classified programs. A redaction that removes the name of an entire division is a different kind of decision. It suggests that even identifying which part of the government Parr was attempting to contact was considered sensitive enough to obscure. That is not a routine archival choice. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. The third request is the least documented of the 3. The surviving record around it is thin enough that establishing even its basic destination is not straightforward. What can be said is that it existed. A reference to it appears in materials from that period in a way that confirms it was made. But the specifics, where it was directed, what it concerned, whether it received any kind of response, are not clearly established in anything that researchers have been able to locate and examine. 3 requests in 6 weeks, each directed outside of Parr's established committee area, and each surrounded by a level of documentary thinness that does not match what routine institutional inquiry typically produces. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the question of justification, because this is one of the more concrete problems in the available record. Senators do occasionally reach outside their assigned committee structures. That happens when a piece of legislation requires cross-departmental understanding, or when a colleague raises a concern that touches on an unfamiliar area. A senator might make inquiries into departments he does not normally engage with, but those inquiries are generally accompanied by some form of documented rationale, a memo explaining the legislative context, a reference to a conversation that prompted the inquiry, some trace, however small, of the reasoning that made the request necessary. That trace is what institutional procedure is designed to produce. And in Parr's case, for all 3 requests, it is absent. No justification is recorded anywhere in the surviving materials. Some would argue that this absence reflects the informal nature of the inquiries, rather than anything more significant. Senators sometimes make inquiries through informal channels, through personal conversations and private contacts, rather than formal written processes. In those cases, the documentation is naturally thinner, because the request itself was never fully committed to paper in the first place. That explanation is not impossible here, but there's a problem with applying it cleanly to par's situation. The requests that do appear in the record are not described in ways that suggest they were informal. They are referenced as specific, directed inquiries, the kind that would normally generate a response through official channels. And in 2 of the 3 cases, no such response appears anywhere in the available record. That absence of response is itself a detail worth examining. Government departments operate according to procedures that are designed to generate documentation. When a sitting senator submits a formal inquiry to a federal department, that department does not typically handle the request without producing some form of written record, an acknowledgement of receipt, a formal response, even if the response is a denial or a referral to another office, a memo noting that the inquiry was received and that appropriate action was taken. These are the kinds of paper traces that institutional processes are built to create. Their absence in 2 of par's 3 cases does not mean the requests were ignored. It means that whatever happened in response to those requests did not leave a trace in the accessible record, and that in itself raises questions. However, the timeline does not fully match the behavior of someone operating through purely informal channels out of casual curiosity. A senator making 3 directed requests in 6 weeks toward departments outside his area of expertise, with no recorded justification and limited documented response, is describing a pattern of behavior that suggests purpose. Something was driving those requests, something specific enough to motivate repeated outward reach during a period when the expected behavior was consolidation and withdrawal. What that something was has not been established, but the pattern itself is clear enough to make the casual curiosity explanation feel insufficient. The redacted division name continues to be one of the more unresolved details in this part of the record. Researchers who have encountered that document have noted the redaction and have attempted, through various means, to identify which security-adjacent division par was attempting to contact. Those attempts have not produced a confirmed answer. The redaction remains in place in the versions of the document that are accessible, and the reason for the redaction, whether it was applied at the time, or applied later during a review process, or applied during a specific declassification procedure that targeted this kind of identifying information, has not been clearly established. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is placed alongside everything else from those 6 weeks, and the accumulated weight of unexplained details becomes harder to set aside. There is also the question of what was happening in the broader institutional environment during early 1961 that might help contextualize par's activity. A new presidential administration had just taken office. Departments were undergoing transition. Certain areas of government were being reorganized in ways that affected both the flow of information and the accessibility of existing records. In that kind of environment, the window for accessing certain types of information was not stable. It was shifting. A senator who wanted to reach certain departments or review certain materials might have felt a specific urgency during that transitional period, an awareness that the access he was seeking might become more restricted rather than less as the new administration settled into place. Whether that kind of urgency shaped par's behavior during those 6 weeks is not something the record confirms, but it is a context that makes the timing of his requests slightly less puzzling, even as it leaves their specific content unexplained. At first, it seems normal for a senator to make a few inquiries in his final weeks, but there's a problem with accepting that framing when the actual details of those inquiries are examined. These were not casual outreach efforts. They were directed toward specific departments. They were made within a concentrated time frame. They lacked the kind of documented justification that formal inquiries normally carry with them, and they produced either no documented response or responses that cannot be located in the accessible archive. That combination of specificity, concentration, missing justification, and absent response is not what routine administrative curiosity looks like. It looks like something more deliberate, something that was, for reasons not yet fully understood, being conducted in a way that minimized the paper trail it would leave behind. Why these particular departments? The question remains without a clear answer. Why this specific 6-week window? So close to the end of career and a life? That also remains unclear. And why does the documentation surrounding these requests remain so consistently thin? across 3 separate inquiries, directed toward 3 separate areas of the government. Some would say the thinness is a product of time and imperfect archiving. Others disagree, pointing to the consistency of the pattern and arguing that consistent gaps of this kind do not typically emerge from random documentary attrition. What can be said with some confidence is that the calendar entries from early 1961 do not describe a senator quietly concluding his service. They describe a senator who was actively looking for something. What he was looking for, and whether he found it before his death in the spring of that year, remains one of the more genuinely unresolved questions in this case. By late 1960, something appears to have shifted in Gerald Parr's behavior. That statement requires careful handling, because the shift was not obvious. It was not the kind of change that announces itself clearly in the historical record. There was no public break, no documented confrontation, no visible moment of crisis that can be pointed to as a before and after marker. What change was subtler than that? It was the kind of change that only becomes visible when small details are placed side by side and examined as a group rather than individually. Taken one at a time, each detail can be explained away. Taken together, they describe something that is harder to dismiss. The first thing worth noting is the change in his attendance at routine Senate sessions. Gerald Parr had a reputation for discipline. That reputation is consistent across the available accounts of his career. He showed up. He participated. He was present in the ways that senators are expected to be present, attending scheduled sessions, sitting through committee proceedings, maintaining the kind of reliable institutional visibility that defines a working political life. This was part of how colleagues understood him, not as a dramatic or influential figure, but as a dependable one, someone whose presence could be relied upon, which is exactly why the change in his attendance pattern during late 1960 was noticed. At least 2 colleagues registered that change in writing. That detail is important. People in political environments observe each other constantly, but they do not always commit those observations to paper. When a colleague's behavior changes noticeably enough that someone writes about it in correspondence, not in a formal report, but in a letter to a party official, it suggests the change was visible enough to prompt a response. One of those letters, written by a fellow senator, described Parr as distracted in a way the writer had not seen before. That phrasing is worth sitting with. Not simply distracted in a new way. A way that was unfamiliar even to someone who had known and observed Parr over a period of years. That distinction matters. It suggests the change was not a temporary variation in mood or energy. It was something qualitatively different from what had come before. But this is where it becomes unclear. The letter that contains this description does not elaborate further. It does not explain what form the distraction took. It does not say whether Parr seemed anxious, preoccupied, withdrawn, or something else entirely. The observation is recorded, and then the correspondence moves on to other subjects. This is frustrating from a research standpoint, because the observation itself is specific enough to be meaningful, but not developed enough to tell us what it was actually pointing at. A fellow senator noticed something. He described it briefly, and then the description ends, leaving the question of what, precisely, was occupying Gerald Parr's attention during those months, without a clear answer. The irregular attendance itself is worth examining from a practical standpoint. Senate sessions follow a structured schedule. Attendance is tracked. Absences are noted. For a senator known for reliability, a pattern of irregular attendance during a specific period would have been visible to more than just a few close colleagues. It would have appeared in the formal attendance records. And here is where a small problem emerges in the available documentation. The attendance records from that period, for the sessions in question, are not as complete as they might be expected to be. Some entries exist. Others are missing or unclear. Whether the gaps in those records reflect genuine absences on Parr's part, or whether they reflect something else in how the records were maintained or preserved, is not something that can be determined from what currently exists in the accessible archive. Around the same time, another detail surfaces. A travel expense record from November 1960 references a trip that does not appear in Parr's official schedule for that period. The destination in that record has been partially obscured in the surviving copy, not fully redacted in the way that certain sensitive documents are handled, but obscured enough that the specific location cannot be clearly identified from what remains. The amount recorded suggests a multi-day journey. It is not a small expense consistent with a local appointment or a brief day trip. It is the kind of amount that implies sustained travel, multiple nights away from Washington, movement to somewhere that required genuine time and distance. The purpose listed for the trip is simply described as personal. That single word sitting in the expense record is one of the more quietly significant details in this entire period of Parr's biography. Personal travel is not unusual. Senators are human beings with private lives, family commitments, and reasons to travel that have nothing to do with their official duties. The category of personal travel exists in expense records precisely because it happens regularly and needs to be distinguished from official business. In most cases, a personal travel entry in an expense record requires no further examination. It is exactly what it appears to be. However, the timeline does not fully match that simple explanation when applied to Parr's situation. This was a senator described by those who knew him as someone who kept detailed records, a man whose professional habits were organized and consistent, who rarely deviated from his established schedule without a documented reason. That profile makes an unscheduled, multi-day trip in November 1960, at precisely the point when his behavior was already being described as unusual by at least one colleague, a detail that is harder to set aside than it might otherwise be. Personal travel by a disciplined, schedule-oriented senator, at a moment of visible behavioral change, with a partially obscure destination and no further documentation of purpose, sits uncomfortably in the record. It is worth asking what November 1960 represented in the broader context of Parr's situation. This was a period of significant political transition. The presidential election of 1960 had just concluded. A new administration was preparing to take office. The institutional environment in Washington was in the process of shifting in ways that would affect how government departments operated, how information flowed, and who had access to what. For someone who was, during this same period, beginning to make inquiries into departments outside his committee area, the timing of an unscheduled personal trip in November 1960 raises a question that the record does not answer. Was the trip connected to those inquiries? Was it a meeting with someone who could not be contacted through official channels? Or was it genuinely unrelated to everything else that was happening during those months? There is no documentation that resolves the question in any direction. That detail sounds minor at first. A travel expense entry with an obscure destination and a one-word purpose description. But when it is placed alongside the attendance irregularities from the same period, and alongside the colleague's written observation about distraction, and alongside the briefing requests that would follow in the coming weeks, the travel entry stops looking minor. It becomes one more element in a collection of details that are individually explainable and collectively difficult to explain away. The pattern they form is not clean. It is not the kind of pattern that points clearly toward a single conclusion, but it is recognizable as a pattern. Something was happening during those months, something that affected Parr's attendance, his behavior as observed by colleagues, his travel, and eventually his formal institutional inquiries. What connected all of these changes has not been established. The missing personal notes from this period add another layer of difficulty to understanding what was happening. Parr was known as someone who kept records. His professional habits, as described in available accounts, included the maintenance of personal notes alongside his formal documentation. Senators often keep private working notes that are separate from their official correspondence. Observations, questions, reminders, records of informal conversations that are not committed to the formal paper trail. Those kinds of notes are often among the most revealing materials in a political figure's archive, precisely because they capture thinking that was never intended for official circulation. In Parr's case, the personal notes from late 1960 and early 1961 are largely absent from what survives in the archive. This is consistent with what has already been observed about the gaps in his documentary record during this period. But it is still worth naming specifically, because notes are exactly the kind of material that might have explained what was driving his behavior during those months. Some researchers who have examined this period of Parr's biography suggest that the behavioral shift visible in late 1960 represents the point at which he became aware of something, not the point at which he acted on that awareness. That appears to come later, with the formal briefing requests and private appointments of early 1961, but the earlier moment when something changed his understanding of a situation he had been observing. This is a hypothesis. It fits the available evidence in the sense that it provides a logical framework for the sequence of changes. But it remains a hypothesis because the specific awareness it proposes, whatever Parr may have learned or discovered, is not documented in anything that has been found. Others disagree with that interpretation. They argue that the behavioral changes visible in late 1960 reflect personal circumstances rather than professional discoveries. Health concerns, family pressures, the natural strain of a long political career approaching its end. Any of these could account for irregular attendance, a private multi-day trip, and the kind of distraction a colleague might notice and mention in correspondence. These are legitimate alternative explanations. They cannot be ruled out. The problem is that they also cannot be confirmed because the personal dimensions of Parr's life during that period are no better documented than the professional ones. The record is thin in both directions. What can be said with some confidence is that the picture of Gerald Parr that emerges from late 1960 is meaningfully different from the picture that the official version presents. The official version describes a quiet, unremarkable senator whose career ended without incident. The details from that period describe someone whose behavior changed in ways that were visible to colleagues, whose schedule included undocumented travel, and whose personal records from those months are largely missing. These two descriptions are not easily reconciled. They do not describe the same situation through different lenses. They describe different situations, and the question of which one more accurately reflects what was actually happening in those months remains genuinely open, not a clear pattern. That qualification is important and worth maintaining. The details from late 1960 do not add up to a confirmed narrative. They do not prove that something significant was happening, any more than they prove that nothing was. What they do is establish that the official version, the clean, unremarkable account of a senator quietly concluding his service, does not fully account for what the surviving evidence shows. Something during those months was different. The attendance was irregular. The travel was undocumented. The behavior was noticed. And the direction in which all of these details point, while not conclusive, is consistent. They do not scatter in different directions, suggesting random variation. They cluster around the same period, the same person, and the same question that runs through this entire case. What was Gerald Parr looking for? And when, exactly, did he begin looking for it? There is one piece of documentation that researchers who have examined Gerald Parr's final months keep returning to. Not because it answers the questions that surround his case. It does not answer them, but because it sits at the center of those questions in a way that makes it impossible to set aside. It is a letter, partially recovered, partially legible, written by Parr himself in January of 1961, and the more carefully it is examined, the more difficult it becomes to read it as an ordinary document produced during an ordinary period of a man's life. The letter was not sent through official channels. That is the first detail worth registering. Senators conducting routine correspondence do so through established institutional processes. Letters go out on official stationery, through office staff, with copies maintained in the formal record. That system exists precisely because official communication needs to be traceable and accountable. When a senator bypasses that system, when a letter is drafted by hand and sent outside of the normal channels, it suggests a deliberate choice, a decision to communicate in a way that would not automatically become part of the institutional record. That choice, by itself, does not indicate anything improper. People write personal letters, but in the context of everything else happening during Parr's final months, the decision to write this particular letter by hand and route it outside official channels is a detail that sits with some weight. The condition of the letter adds another layer of difficulty to working with it. It is partially recovered and only partially legible. What this means in practical terms is that the full text of the letter is not available to researchers. Portions of it can be read. Other portions cannot, whether due to physical damage to the document itself, to the way it was stored or handled over the decades, or to some other factor that has not been clearly established. Working with a partially legible document is always challenging, because the portions that cannot be read might contain the most significant information, or they might contain nothing that would change the meaning of what is already visible. There is no way to know which is true without access to the complete text, and the complete text, in this case, does not appear to be available. The identity of the recipient is one of the portions that cannot be fully established from what remains. The name is not completely readable in the surviving copy of the letter. What is readable suggests that the letter was directed to someone outside the Senate, not a colleague, not a government official operating within the institutional environment Parr was part of, someone on the outside. Some researchers who have examined the document believe the recipient may have been a journalist. Others suggest a private contact of some kind, someone with a connection to Parr that predated his political career, or someone he had encountered through channels that did not intersect with his official work. The exact relationship between Parr and the intended recipient has not been clearly established, and without that clarity, the context for why he chose this particular person to write to remains an open question. But this is where it becomes unclear in a way that is particularly important. The choice of recipient, someone outside the Senate, possibly a journalist, possibly a private contact, tells us something about Parr's intentions, even without knowing the specific identity of the person. If he was writing to a journalist, it suggests he was considering the possibility of bringing whatever he knew or suspected to a wider audience. If he was writing to a private contact, it suggests he was seeking a trusted outside perspective on what he was dealing with. Either interpretation implies that Parr felt he could not handle whatever he was confronting entirely within the institutional environment he was part of, that he needed to reach outside of it. Why he felt that way is not explained in the portions of the letter that can be read, but the act of reaching outside suggests a specific kind of judgment about the situation he was in. The readable portions of the letter contain language that is precise enough to be significant and vague enough to resist simple interpretation. Parr writes that he has become aware of a process that does not match its stated purpose. That sentence is worth reading slowly. He is not describing a minor administrative inconsistency. He is describing something that presents itself as one thing while actually being another. A process with a stated purpose, an official, acknowledged function, that does not correspond to what the process is actually doing. That is a specific kind of observation. It requires a person to have access to both the stated purpose and the actual operation of the thing being described. It requires comparison, and the comparison, in Parr's framing, has produced a discrepancy significant enough to write about. He does not name the process. That is an important absence. He had the opportunity to be specific, and he chose not to be. This could reflect caution, an awareness that the letter might be read by someone other than its intended recipient, and a deliberate decision to limit the identifying information it contained. It could also reflect uncertainty, a situation where he understood that something was wrong without yet having enough information to name it precisely. Or it could reflect something else entirely, the absence of a name, in a sentence that otherwise describes the problem with some clarity, leaves a gap that the available record does not fill. He does not name those involved. This is a second significant absence. A process that does not match its stated purpose involves people. It involves decisions, actions, and responsibilities that belong to specific individuals or groups. Parr, if he had become aware of such a process, would presumably have some sense of whose process it was. And yet the letter, in the portions that are readable, does not identify anyone connected to what he is describing. The same logic applies here as with the unnamed process. Caution, uncertainty, or deliberate omission. Any of these could account for the absence. None of them can be confirmed as the correct explanation. What he does right, in the readable portions of the letter, is that he intends to seek clarification through the appropriate channels before taking any further steps. That is careful language. It is the kind of phrasing that a person uses when they are aware that what they are writing could be read by an audience broader than the intended recipient. The appropriate channels is an institutional phrase. It signals an intention to work within the system rather than around it. It signals patience and procedure, but it also signals something else. It signals that Parr was thinking about further steps, that what he was describing was not a closed matter in his mind. He had become aware of something. He was planning to seek clarification, and beyond that clarification, he was contemplating additional action. What that action might have been is not described anywhere in the surviving portions of the letter. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the letter appears to have no follow-up. No response to it has been found in any archive or collection of documents that researchers have been able to examine. Whether the letter was received by its intended recipient is not established. Whether the recipient responded through a channel that simply has not been located, or whether the response does not exist because the letter never arrived, or because the recipient chose not to respond, or because the response was lost or destroyed at some point. None of these possibilities can be confirmed or eliminated from the available evidence. The letter goes out, so far as the record shows, and then the record goes silent. Whether Parr ever sought the clarification he described in the letter is also unknown. The briefing requests he made during the same period, the 3 directed inquiries toward departments outside his committee area, might represent his attempt to seek that clarification through the institutional channels he referenced. But that connection is not established in any document. It is an inference based on timing and the general direction of his activity during those weeks. Inferences built on timing are useful for generating questions. They are not sufficient for generating answers. That detail sounds minor at first, the absence of a follow-up, the missing response, the unconfirmed outcome of the clarification Parr intended to seek. But when the full context of those 11 weeks is held in view, the silence that follows the letter becomes harder to treat as minor. 11 weeks. That is the distance between the date the letter was written and the date of Gerald Parr's death in the spring of 1961. 11 weeks during which he may or may not have pursued the clarification he described. 11 weeks during which the briefing requests were made and largely went unanswered. 11 weeks that are, in the surviving documentary record, among the most thinly documented of his entire career. And then, at the end of those 11 weeks, a death recorded as cardiac failure with no public notice and minimal institutional acknowledgement. This does not establish a connection. That statement needs to be made clearly and maintained. A letter written 11 weeks before a person's death does not, by itself, imply that the death was connected to the letter's contents. People write letters and then die of natural causes. The proximity in time is not evidence of causation. What it is a fact, and facts that are uncomfortable to sit with still need to be acknowledged. The letter exists. The timeline exists. The silence that follows the letter exists. None of these things prove anything, but they also do not permit the case to be closed in the way the official record suggests it should be. Some researchers who have spent time with this document describe a specific experience of reading it. The careful language, the unnamed process, the unnamed individuals, the stated intention to seek clarification before going further. These elements together produce the impression of someone who was being deliberate, someone who understood the weight of what they were describing and was choosing their words accordingly, not someone writing impulsively or in a state of agitation, someone who had thought about what they were committing to paper. That impression, however, is a reading of language and tone rather than a verifiable fact. Others might read the same portions of the letter and form a different impression. The document does not resolve into a single clear meaning. What it does do is anchor the broader questions around Parr's final months to something concrete. The behavioral changes of late 1960, the irregular attendance, the undocumented travel, the briefing requests directed outside his committee area, the missing personal notes. These were all observations built from gaps and fragments. The letter is different. It is something Parr himself wrote, a document in which his own words, however carefully guarded, acknowledged that he was aware of something he considered significant enough to describe to someone outside the Senate, a process that does not match its stated purpose. Those are his words, or as close to his words as the partially legible surviving copy allows, and they are very difficult to read in the context of everything surrounding them and find entirely unremarkable. What makes the Parr case harder to dismiss is that it does not stand entirely alone. That is an important observation, and it requires careful handling. It is not being suggested here that a clear pattern of connected events has been established, or that a confirmed explanation exists for what that pattern might represent. Neither of those things is true. What is true is that when researchers began looking at Senate records from roughly the same period, the late 1950s and early 1960s, They found that Gerald Parr was not the only figure whose documentary record contained the kinds of gaps, irregularities, and unexplained clusters of activity that have made his case so difficult to close. To understand why this matters, it helps to think about what it means for a case to stand alone versus what it means for a case to appear within a broader context. A single instance of unusual behavior, missing documentation, and unexplained activity can be attributed to individual circumstances. One senator making irregular briefing requests and dying of cardiac failure is a fact that exists in isolation. It can be examined, noted, and ultimately set aside because there's no larger frame around it. But when similar patterns appear more than once, in similar institutional environments, during similar periods of time, the question of whether individual explanations are sufficient becomes harder to answer. The pattern itself becomes something that needs to be addressed. The two additional cases identified by researchers are less documented than Parr's. That qualification matters and should not be minimized. The Parr case, for all its gaps and missing materials, has enough surviving documentation to build a coherent account of the irregularities surrounding his final months. The calendar entries, the briefing requests, the partially legible letter, the travel expense record. These are specific, examinable pieces of evidence that can be discussed in concrete terms. The two other cases do not have the same level of surviving material. What has been identified is enough to establish that a similar pattern was present. It is not enough to construct the same kind of detailed examination that the Parr materials permit. Both of those cases have been largely ignored in mainstream historical work. That observation is worth sitting with for a moment. Historical research does not cover everything equally. Figures who operated without high public profiles, who served on mid-level committees and left behind thin documentary records, tend to receive less attention from historians than more prominent political actors. This is a natural feature of how historical knowledge develops, not necessarily a sign that something is being deliberately overlooked, but it does mean that cases which might reveal significant patterns can remain unexamined for decades, simply because no one with the resources and access to investigate them has made them a priority. The question of whether these two additional cases would yield more information under closer examination is one that the available research does not currently answer. At first, it seems reasonable to treat the three cases as separate and unconnected. Coincidence exists. That needs to be stated clearly and taken seriously as an explanation. Men in their 60s, working in the stressful environment of political life during the late 1950s and early 1960s, faced genuine and significant health risks. Cardiac events were common during that era. Medical understanding of heart disease, its early warning signs, and its prevention was considerably less developed than it is today. A senator experiencing a sudden cardiac event was not a statistically unusual occurrence. It happened. It happened regularly. And the fact that it happened to more than one senator during a given period does not automatically require an explanation beyond the straightforward medical one. But there's a problem with stopping there. The cardiac events themselves are not what makes the pattern worth noting. What makes it worth noting is the specific combination of activities that preceded them. Informal information requests directed outside normal committee areas. Missing or incomplete documentation around those requests. Undocumented travel during the same period. A subsequent decline in health that followed relatively quickly after these activities. Each of these elements, taken individually, can be explained through ordinary means. Together, appearing more than once, in the same institutional environment, during the same general period of history, they form something that at minimum deserves acknowledgement as an unusual cluster. Some researchers who specialize in Cold War-era political history have looked at this cluster and noted it without drawing firm conclusions. This is a significant detail about how the pattern has been received within the academic community. These are not researchers who are prone to dramatic claims or unsupported interpretations. They are people who work carefully with primary sources, who understand the limitations of incomplete records, and who are professionally cautious about the conclusions they commit to in their published work. And yet they have described what appears across these cases as a recurring administrative gap. That is their language. Precise, measured, deliberately non-committal. A recurring administrative gap. Not a conspiracy. Not a cover-up. not evidence of intentional wrongdoing, simply a gap, one that recurs, in the same general context. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because a recurring administrative gap is itself something that requires explanation. Administrative gaps happen. Records are lost. Documents are misfiled. Institutional processes produce incomplete paper trails for all kinds of mundane reasons. But when the same type of gap recurs around the same type of activity, in the same institutional environment, during the same historical period, the explanation of routine administrative imperfection starts to feel insufficient. Routine imperfection tends to be random. It tends to scatter unevenly across different types of records and different periods. What has been observed in the Parr case and the two comparable cases is not random scattering. It is a cluster. And clusters, in research of any kind, are things that ask to be explained. The Cold War context of this period is relevant to that question, though it must be handled carefully. The late 1950s and early 1960s were a period during which the management of sensitive information within the American government was extraordinarily active. Classification systems were being developed and applied broadly. Certain areas of government activity were being conducted in ways that deliberately minimized the documentary record they produced. The institutional environment of that era was one in which information could be contained, redirected, and obscured through mechanisms that were themselves not always formally documented. This is not a controversial historical observation. It is part of the established understanding of how certain government functions operated during that period. Whether those mechanisms had any connection to the administrative gaps observed around Parr and the comparable cases is a question the available evidence does not answer. But the context exists, and ignoring it entirely would be its own kind of distortion. However, the timeline does not fully support a simple institutional explanation for all three cases. If the recurring administrative gap were purely a product of how records were maintained and preserved during that era, it would be expected to appear more broadly. It would show up across many different types of senatorial activity, not specifically around informal information requests and health events. The fact that the gap appears to cluster around a specific combination of activities, the reaching outside committee areas, the missing documentation, the undocumented travel, rather than appearing randomly across the broader record, is what makes the standard archival explanation feel incomplete. Not wrong necessarily, but incomplete. There's also the question of what the two additional cases might reveal if they were examined more thoroughly. The researchers who identified them noted their existence and noted the pattern they shared with Parr's case, but the depth of examination applied to those cases has been limited by the thinness of the available materials. That thinness is itself an observation. If the records around those cases are thin in the same ways that the records around the relevant periods of Parr's case are thin, if the gaps are located in similar places, around similar types of activity, then the thinness becomes part of the pattern rather than simply a research obstacle. Whether a more sustained examination of those materials would produce a clearer picture, or whether the gaps are genuinely too large to bridge, is not something that can be determined from the current state of research. That detail sounds minor at first, two additional cases, less documented, largely ignored. But when it is placed alongside the Parr case, and the question of what connects them is held seriously, the minor detail becomes something more consequential. Three cases, similar patterns, same institutional environment, same general historical period, same type of administrative gap appearing in the same relative position within each case. The probability that this reflects pure coincidence decreases as the number of instances increases. That is not a claim about what the pattern means. It is an observation about the nature of patterns themselves. What created the recurring gap? That is the question that the researchers who identified it have not been able to answer with any certainty. Three possibilities exist at the broadest level. The first is standard bureaucratic inefficiency. Records were poorly maintained, imperfectly preserved, and the gaps reflect nothing more than the ordinary failures of institutional documentation during a busy and complicated period of American political history. The second is that the gaps were intentional, that someone or some process actively managed the documentary record around these cases in ways that removed or obscured certain types of information. The third is that something else is responsible, some explanation that the available evidence does not yet make visible. All three possibilities remain open. None of them can be confirmed or eliminated from what currently exists in the accessible record. Each time this question is examined, it leads to the same place, not to an answer, to more questions. The cases that were supposed to be simple, unremarkable senators, natural deaths, routine records, turn out to contain layers that the surface description does not account for. And those layers, when examined carefully, do not resolve into clarity. They reveal more complexity, more absence, more places where the record should contain something and does not. Some researchers find this frustrating. Others find it significant in its own right, arguing that the consistency of the unresolved questions is itself a form of information about what happened during those years in that institutional environment. What is clear is that the Parr case, whatever it ultimately represents, is not an isolated anomaly in an otherwise clean historical record. It exists alongside other cases that share its most unusual features. It exists within a period of history where the management of sensitive information was an active and sophisticated institutional practice, and it exists within a body of research that has, so far, produced more questions than answers every time it has been seriously examined. Whether those questions will ever be answered depends on what materials remain undiscovered in archives that have not yet been fully examined, and on whether the researchers with the tools and access to examine them choose to do so. For now, the questions remain open, and the recurring administrative gap remains one of the more quietly persistent puzzles in the political history of that period. The difficulty with understanding what Gerald Parr may have known is not simply a matter of missing documents or incomplete archives. It runs deeper than that. To understand why the gaps in his record are so hard to interpret, it is necessary to first understand the environment in which he was operating, because that environment, the institutional world of the American government in the early 1960s, was itself deeply unclear, not just from the outside looking back across decades. It was unclear from the inside, in real time, to the people who were part of it, and that internal lack of clarity shaped everything about how information moved, who had access to it, and what happened when someone began asking questions that touched on areas that were not meant to be examined too closely. The early 1960s were a period of significant governmental activity in the United States. That statement on its own is not controversial. It is simply a description of a historically active period. What makes it relevant to the Parr case is the nature of that activity. A substantial portion of what the government was doing during those years was not publicly acknowledged. Programs existed that had no official public presence. Departments conducted operations through channels that were deliberately designed to bypass normal record-keeping procedures. The institutional machinery of the American government during that period was layered in ways that made it genuinely difficult, even for people inside that machinery, to understand the full scope of what was happening around them. Information during this period was deliberately compartmentalized. That is a specific word with a specific meaning in institutional contexts. Compartmentalization means that different people and different departments are given access only to the portions of information that are considered relevant to their specific role. They do not see the full picture. They see only their section of it. This approach to information management was not unique to that era, and it is not inherently suspicious. There are legitimate reasons for managing sensitive information in ways that limit its circulation. But during the early 1960s, compartmentalization was applied not only to genuine national security concerns. It was also applied, in some cases, simply to limit accountability, to ensure that the full scope of certain programs and operations would not be visible to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about them. That distinction between compartmentalization for security and compartmentalization for accountability management is an important one, and it is a distinction that the official record rarely makes explicit. In that kind of environment, the position of a senator asking questions about programs or departments that operated within that compartmentalized structure was an unusual one, not automatically dangerous. That needs to be said clearly. There is nothing in the available record to suggest that senators who made inquiries into sensitive areas of government during this period were routinely placed in any kind of direct personal jeopardy. But they could find themselves in a position that was procedurally complicated, a position where the normal channels of institutional inquiry did not function the way they were supposed to, where requests went unanswered, where access was delayed or quietly denied, where the machinery that was supposed to respond to legitimate inquiry simply did not respond, and where the non-response itself was never formally acknowledged or explained. This is a specific kind of institutional experience, and it is worth pausing on what it would actually feel like from the inside. A senator submits a request. He waits for a response that does not come. He submits another request, or seeks access through a different channel. That also produces no clear response. The files he is looking for are not available, for reasons that are not explained. The briefing he requested is not scheduled, without any formal denial being issued. From the outside, looking at the documentary record of this sequence, it appears as gaps and absences. From the inside, experiencing it in real time, it would have felt like resistance. Quiet, procedural, deniable resistance. The kind that leaves no clear fingerprints because it operates through inaction rather than action. If Gerald Parr had encountered something along those lines, if, through the normal course of his committee work or through some other channel, he had come across information that touched on a program or operation that was not meant to be examined, the institutional response would not necessarily have been dramatic. This is an important point. Popular understanding of what happens when someone in a sensitive environment discovers something they are not supposed to know tends toward dramatic scenarios, confrontations, explicit warnings, clear moments of conflict. But the reality of how such situations were typically managed in the institutional environment of the early 1960s was considerably quieter than that. The response, when it came, was bureaucratic, procedural, a series of non-responses rather than a series of direct refusals. At first, this seems like it might actually work in favor of a simple explanation. If the response to Parr's inquiries was purely procedural, delayed access, missing files, unanswered requests, then perhaps the explanation is exactly what it appears to be. Bureaucratic friction, the ordinary difficulty of navigating a complicated institutional structure during a busy and transitional period. This is a reasonable position. It cannot be dismissed. Bureaucratic friction is real, and it accounts for a great deal of what looks, at a distance, like something more intentional. But there is a problem with applying that explanation cleanly to the Parr case. Bureaucratic friction tends to be inconsistent and uneven. It slows things down without following a recognizable pattern. What the surviving record around Parr's inquiries shows is not uneven friction. It is a specific and consistent type of non-response applied to a specific type of inquiry during a specific and concentrated period of time. That consistency is harder to attribute to ordinary bureaucratic difficulty. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult in a way that is genuinely hard to resolve, because the record that survives from Parr's final months does not show a dramatic confrontation or an explicit denial. It shows exactly what would be expected if a quiet, procedural form of institutional resistance had been applied to his inquiries. Doors that did not open, records that do not exist in the archive where they should be, requests that were made and never formally responded to, non-responses where responses should appear. That is the shape of the surviving record, and that shape fits, with uncomfortable precision, the description of how sensitive programs and operations in that era were protected from unwanted examination, not through dramatic action, through the management of access and documentation. However, the timeline does not fully permit certainty about what that shape actually means. The same record that fits the description of deliberate institutional resistance also fits the description of ordinary bureaucratic failure during a complicated period. The gaps could have been created intentionally. They could also have developed naturally through imperfect record-keeping, incomplete archiving, and the general disorder that characterized document management in many government offices during the transitions of the early 1960s. From the documentary evidence alone, it is not possible to determine which of these explanations is correct, and this is not a false equivalence. Both explanations are genuinely possible. Both are consistent with what the record shows. The record itself does not resolve the question. Some researchers who have worked with materials from this period argue that the pattern of non-response visible in Parr's case is too specific and too consistent to be explained by ordinary bureaucratic failure. They point to the clustering of the gaps, the way they appear around a specific type of inquiry, rather than being distributed randomly across the broader record, as evidence that something more deliberate was operating. Others disagree. They argue that the period was sufficiently chaotic institutionally, and the record-keeping sufficiently imperfect, that patterns of this kind can emerge from purely natural causes without implying intention. Both positions are held by researchers who have examined the materials carefully. Neither position has produced a definitive resolution. The compartmentalization practices of that era also make it specifically difficult to trace what Parr might have encountered. If he came across something through his committee work, a reference in a document, a discrepancy between what he was told and what he observed, a connection between two pieces of information that were not meant to be seen together, that encounter would not necessarily have been recorded anywhere. Compartmentalization, by design, limits the traces that sensitive information leaves as it moves through an institutional system. A senator noticing a discrepancy does not generate a document. A senator making a mental connection between two pieces of information does not leave a paper trail. What he does next, the inquiries he makes, the requests he submits, the letters he writes, can leave traces. And those traces are exactly what the Parr record contains, in fragmented and incomplete form. That detail sounds minor at first, the idea that something could be noticed without being documented, until it is understood as the central challenge of this entire case. The thing that Parr appears to have become aware of, whatever it was, left no direct trace in any record that has been found. What survived are the secondary traces, the actions he took in response to whatever he had noticed, the requests, the appointments, the letter, the travel. These are the footprints of someone responding to something. But the thing itself, the specific information or discrepancy that set his final months of inquiry in motion, remains absent from the accessible record. And in an environment where compartmentalization was actively practiced, that absence is precisely what would be expected. There is a version of this story in which everything that appears unusual about Parr's final months has a simple explanation. In that version, the missing records are missing because of imperfect archiving. The unanswered requests were unanswered because of bureaucratic delays. The undelivered letters were lost in transit. The undocumented travel was genuinely personal. The death was cardiac failure, with no other contributing circumstances. Every individual element of the case finds its own ordinary explanation, and the case closes. Some believe that version is the correct one. They argue that the accumulation of unusual details is a product of selective attention, that researchers focusing on Parr's case naturally notice the gaps and irregularities because those are the things they are looking for, while the ordinary elements of his record receive less attention. Others disagree. They argue that the version in which everything has a simple explanation requires too many coincidences operating simultaneously, in too specific a direction, to be more plausible than the alternative, that the pattern is too consistent and the gaps too concentrated around a specific type of activity during a specific period, to be fully accounted for by ordinary explanations. And without clear documentation, without the files that are missing, the letters that were never delivered, the responses that were never recorded, there is genuinely no way to determine which of these positions is closer to the truth. The institutional context of the early 1960s created conditions in which deliberate management of information and ordinary bureaucratic failure could produce records that look nearly identical to each other from a research perspective. And that similarity is precisely what makes the Parr case, decades later, so resistant to a satisfying resolution. Those who have looked closely at the Parr case tend to arrive at different places, not wildly different places. The available evidence is limited enough that the range of serious interpretations remains relatively contained. But within that range, meaningful disagreements exist. Disagreements about what the surviving materials actually show, about how much weight individual pieces of evidence should carry, and about what framework best accounts for the overall pattern of gaps, irregularities, and unanswered questions that define this case. Understanding those disagreements, and why none of them has produced a resolution, is itself an important part of understanding why the Parr case remains open. The first interpretation is the most straightforward. It holds that Gerald Parr was an aging senator dealing with the ordinary administrative complexity that comes at the end of a long political career. Loose ends. Unresolved institutional matters. The kind of accumulated business that any person in his position would need to address before leaving office. In this reading, the briefing requests were routine inquiries that happened to fall outside his committee area for reasons that were mundane and now unrecoverable from the available record. The missing documentation is a product of the era's inconsistent archiving practices rather than any deliberate management of information. The undocumented travel was personal in the straightforward sense of the word, and the death was cardiac failure. A man in his early 60s, in declining health, working in a demanding environment, died of a common medical cause. Nothing more. This interpretation has genuine strengths. It does not require the existence of anything beyond what ordinary institutional and biographical circumstances can produce. It does not depend on the assumption that deliberate action was taken to obscure or remove information. It takes the available evidence at face value and builds from there. For researchers who are cautious about inferring intention from absence, who are professionally skeptical of explanations that require filling documentary gaps with speculation, this interpretation is the most defensible one. Some believe it covers everything. They argue that the unusual features of the Parr case are unusual only because researchers are paying closer attention to this particular record than they would to most comparable figures from the same period, and that a similarly close examination of any senator's final months might reveal comparable gaps and irregularities. But there's a problem with accepting that argument entirely. The level of attention paid to the Parr case was itself generated by the specific combination of features in his record. Researchers did not begin examining his final months arbitrarily. They began examining them because the pattern of irregularities was visible enough to attract notice. If the same pattern appeared in every senator's record from that period, it would be unremarkable. The fact that it was noticed and considered worth examining suggests it was not entirely ordinary. The first interpretation does not fully account for why these particular gaps cluster around this particular period of this particular senator's life in the specific way they do. The second interpretation acknowledges that clustering and attempts to explain it. It proposes that Parr had become aware of a specific program or policy that he found troubling, not through dramatic discovery, but through the gradual accumulation of observations during the normal course of his work. A discrepancy noticed in a document, a reference encountered in a briefing that did not match what he understood to be the case, a connection made between two pieces of information that were apparently not intended to be seen in relation to each other. In this reading, Parr was not a whistleblower in the traditional sense. He was not preparing a public accusation or planning a dramatic confrontation. He was doing what a careful, measured, institutionally cautious senator would do. He was trying to understand what he had noticed before deciding what to do about it. This second interpretation accounts for the specific character of his activity during those final months in a way that the first does not. The private appointments, the directed briefing requests, the handwritten letter to someone outside the Senate. These are the actions of someone pursuing a specific line of inquiry, not someone tidying administrative loose ends. The careful language in a letter, describing a process that does not match its stated purpose, expressing an intention to seek clarification through appropriate channels, fits the profile of a person who has identified something specific and is trying to verify it before committing to a course of action. In this reading, Parr's death was natural, cardiac failure, as the death certificate states, but the circumstances that surrounded the final months of his life were not random. They were shaped by something he had encountered and was attempting to understand. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the second interpretation, while it accounts for more of the available evidence than the first, also requires accepting several things that cannot be confirmed. It requires that Parr had indeed discovered something specific. It requires that his subsequent activity was directed by that discovery. And it requires that the thinness of the documentary record around his final months reflects at least some degree of deliberate management of information, whether by Parr himself, who was clearly writing letters by hand and operating outside official channels, or by the institutional environment responding to his inquiries. None of these requirements are impossible, but none of them can be fully established from what currently exists in the accessible record. The third interpretation is the most direct and the most difficult to hold without overstating what the evidence actually supports. It proposes that Parr's inquiries made certain parties uncomfortable, and that the removal of documentation from the record was not accidental. That someone, or some institutional process, actively managed the paper trail around Parr's final months in a way that reduced what was visible to future researchers. This interpretation does not necessarily require that anything was done to Parr directly. It simply proposes that the gaps in his record are not random or natural, that they were created, and that the consistency of those gaps, the way they cluster around a specific type of activity during a specific period, reflects a deliberate outcome rather than a coincidental one. This interpretation is held by a smaller number of researchers than the first two. That fact is worth acknowledging. It is not held by a fringe. The people who have arrived at this position have done so through careful examination of the available materials, and they make specific arguments about why the pattern of absences in Parr's record does not fit what ordinary archival attrition would produce. But it is a minority position, and it carries a heavier evidentiary burden than the other two. Proposing that documentation was deliberately removed requires either direct evidence of that removal or a pattern of absence so specific and consistent that it cannot be plausibly explained in any other way. Some researchers believe the Parr record meets that threshold. Others disagree and argue that the evidence, while unusual, does not clearly cross the line between suggestive and demonstrable. However, the timeline does not fully resolve the disagreement between these three positions. This is one of the more frustrating aspects of the case from a research standpoint. Cases of this kind are sometimes resolved when new materials surface, when an archive releases previously restricted documents, when a private collection becomes accessible, when a letter or set of notes is found that changes the interpretive framework. In the Parr case, no such resolution has occurred. The materials that exist have been examined. The gaps that exist remain gaps. And the three interpretations continue to sit alongside each other in the research literature without any of them having been clearly eliminated or confirmed. What is agreed upon across most of these interpretations, including, significantly, among those who favor the most straightforward explanation, is that the official record as it stands is incomplete. That is a point of genuine consensus. Researchers who believe Parr's case has an entirely ordinary explanation still acknowledge that the record does not fully document what happened during his final months. The materials that should exist, based on the institutional processes that were in place at the time, are not all present in the accessible archive. Something is missing. The disagreement is not about whether the record is incomplete. The disagreement is about what caused the incompleteness and whether that cause matters. That distinction is an important one. A record can be incomplete for reasons that are historically insignificant. Documents are lost. Archives are imperfectly maintained. The passage of time degrades both physical materials and institutional memory. Incompleteness, in the abstract, is not evidence of anything beyond the ordinary fragility of historical documentation, but incompleteness that follows a specific pattern, that clusters around specific types of activity, that appears to concentrate around a specific period, that leaves certain questions systematically unanswerable while leaving others clearly documented, is a different kind of incompleteness. It is the kind that asks to be explained rather than simply accepted. Some believe the explanation is simple and has already been provided in the first interpretation. Others find that explanation insufficient when applied to the specific shape of what is missing. That disagreement has never been resolved. It has persisted through whatever examination the case has received, and it shows no signs of resolving itself without new materials or new research methods being applied to what already exists. The case sits, as many cases from that period sit, in a space between what is known and what can be confirmed. The outline of something is visible. The interior remains unclear. That detail sounds minor when it is described abstractly. A disagreement among researchers, an incomplete record, a few unanswered questions about a senator who died more than 6 decades ago, until the specific content of those questions is remembered. A sitting senator making unusual inquiries in his final weeks. A letter describing a process that did not match its stated purpose. A documentary record that thins out in precisely the places where it should be most detailed. These are not abstract archival puzzles. They are specific, concrete details about a specific person during a specific period, and the fact that they remain unexplained is not a minor footnote. It is the central unresolved fact of a case that the official record considers closed. Whether that matters is a question each person examining this case must answer for themselves based on how they weigh the available evidence and how they think about the relationship between documentary gaps and historical truth. What can be said with confidence is that the three interpretations currently on the table do not exhaust the possibilities, and that none of them has been sufficiently supported by the available evidence to render the others obsolete. The official record is incomplete. The disagreement about what that incompleteness means remains unresolved, and the question of what Gerald Parr knew, what he was looking for, and what happened to the documentation surrounding his search continues to sit without a satisfying answer in any archive that researchers have been able to examine. Gerald Parr has been dead for more than 60 years. That is a long time, long enough that the people who knew him personally, who sat in the same rooms with him, who observed his behavior during those final months and might have understood what was driving it, are also gone. Long enough that institutional memories have faded. Informal conversations that might have provided context were never recorded and are now irrecoverable. And the physical materials from that period have either survived in their current incomplete form or have not survived at all. 60 years is long enough that the window for resolving certain kinds of questions through direct human testimony has closed entirely. What remains is the documentary record, and the documentary record, as has been established through everything examined in this case, is partial. The files that Parr requested during his final weeks have never been fully identified. That fact sits at the center of this case in a way that is easy to state and difficult to fully absorb. A sitting senator made formal requests for access to specific government materials. Those requests are documented, at least partially, in the surviving record. The materials he was requesting have not been identified with any clarity. Whether they were ever located by the departments he contacted, whether access was granted or denied, whether anyone reviewed them in response to his inquiry and then reported back to him through some channel that left no surviving trace. None of this is known. The requests point toward something. What they point toward remains, after decades of existing in the available archive, unresolved. The letter he wrote in January of 1961 has never been traced to a recipient. This is another fact that is straightforward to state and genuinely difficult to explain away. A letter written by a sitting senator, describing something he had become aware of, expressing an intention to seek clarification before taking further steps, sent outside official channels to someone whose identity cannot be clearly established from the surviving portion of the document, and no confirmed recipient has ever been identified. No response to the letter has been found in any archive or collection. No reference to having received such a letter has surfaced in the papers of anyone from that period who might plausibly have been the intended reader. The letter exists. Its destination does not appear to exist anywhere in the accessible record. And that combination, a document that was sent and a destination that cannot be confirmed, is one of the more quietly persistent puzzles in this entire case. His personal notes have never been located. For a senator described by those who knew him as organized and detail-oriented, someone who maintained careful records throughout his career, the absence of personal notes from his final months is a specific and significant gap. Personal notes are often the most revealing materials in a political figure's archive precisely because they were not written for an official audience. They capture thinking that formal correspondence does not. Observations that were never meant to be circulated, questions that a person was working through privately. For Parr, in a period when he appears to have been actively pursuing something he found significant, personal notes would potentially have been the clearest window into what he was thinking and what he had found. They are not there. Whether they were never kept during those particular months, whether they were lost through ordinary attrition, or whether something else accounts for their absence is a question the record does not answer. What remains, after everything that has been examined, is a partial picture. That description is accurate and should be taken seriously in both directions. Partial means incomplete. It means there are things that cannot be known from what currently exists. But partial also means that something is there. The picture is not empty. It contains specific, concrete details that describe a specific, concrete situation. A senator who was careful and disciplined throughout his career became, in his final weeks, suddenly and specifically interested in information outside his normal domain. He reached toward departments he had no established connection to. He made requests that were either unanswered or whose answers cannot be found. He wrote a letter by hand, outside official channels, describing something he had noticed that did not match its stated purpose. And then he died. The partial picture contains all of these things. It simply does not contain enough to close the questions they raise. The official explanation for all of this is that none of it amounts to anything significant, that a man's final months, when examined through the lens of incomplete records, can appear meaningful when they are in fact simply ordinary. This is a position that deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. It is not an unreasonable argument. Human beings are pattern-seeking by nature. When attention is focused on a specific set of documents relating to a specific period in a specific person's life, there is a natural tendency to find patterns that may not reflect anything beyond the limits of the available evidence. A researcher looking for significance will sometimes find the appearance of significance in materials that, viewed more broadly, would not attract particular notice. This is a genuine methodological concern, and it is one that careful researchers working with the PAR materials have acknowledged. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the official explanation, while reasonable in principle, faces a specific problem when applied to the actual details of this case. The argument that incomplete records can create the appearance of significance depends on the assumption that the incompleteness is random, that the gaps are distributed across the record in ways that reflect ordinary documentary attrition rather than a consistent pattern. In the PAR case, as has been examined across multiple aspects of his final months, the gaps are not randomly distributed. They are concentrated. They appear around specific types of activity during a specific period. They are absent precisely where they would be most informative and present where they provide the least insight into what was actually happening. Random incompleteness does not typically produce that kind of distribution. Patterned incompleteness does. At first, it seems sufficient to say that the official version may simply be correct, and that the discomfort with accepting it reflects an unwillingness to let an unresolved case remain unresolved. That is a fair criticism of how some cases are handled in historical research. The desire for resolution can sometimes push interpretation beyond what the evidence actually supports. But there is a problem with applying that criticism uniformly to every aspect of the PAR case. The discomfort with the official version is not generated by a desire for a more interesting story. It is generated by specific, identifiable features of the documentary record that do not fit the pattern the official version predicts. An ordinary conclusion to an ordinary career should leave behind an ordinary record. The record from PAR's final months is not ordinary in the specific ways that have been described throughout this examination, and the official version does not explain why it is not. That detail sounds minor at first, the question of whether a particular documentary record is ordinary or not, until it is understood as the foundational issue on which the entire case rests. If the record from PAR's final months is ordinary, then the official version is correct and the questions raised by the case are the product of overinterpretation. If the record is genuinely unusual in ways that cannot be fully explained by ordinary archival imperfection, then the official version is insufficient, and the questions remain genuinely open. Determining which of those is true requires a level of certainty about what ordinary records from that period look like that the current state of research does not fully provide. And without that certainty, the official version cannot be accepted or rejected with the confidence that a closed case requires. Reasonable positions are not always complete ones. That observation is one of the more important frames for thinking about where this case currently stands. The official version is reasonable. It does not claim more than the evidence requires. It does not propose mechanisms or intentions that go beyond what the documentary record confirms. In that sense, it is the epistemically cautious position, but reasonable and complete are different qualities. A position can be entirely reasonable and still leave significant aspects of the available evidence unaccounted for. The official version of the PAR case does not account for the pattern of the gaps. It does not account for the specific direction of the briefing requests. It does not account for the handwritten letters sent outside official channels. It does not account for the absence of personal notes during precisely the period when those notes would have been most informative. These are not minor omissions from the official account. They are the features of the case that make it resistant to closure. What did Gerald Parr know? That question has been present throughout this examination and has not been answered because the available evidence does not answer it. It establishes that he was looking for something. It suggests he believed he had encountered a discrepancy between what something was officially described as and what it was actually doing. It shows that he pursued that discrepancy through multiple channels during a concentrated period of time. But what the specific content of his awareness was, what program, what process, what information, remains outside what the surviving record contains. The question is not unanswerable in principle. It is unanswerable from what currently exists in accessible archives. What was he looking for? This question is slightly different from the first, and the distinction matters. Knowing what someone was aware of and knowing what they were actively pursuing in response to that awareness are related but separate things. The evidence suggests Parr was pursuing clarification. He wanted to understand what he had noticed well enough to decide what to do about it. Whether he was looking for confirmation, for context, for the names of those responsible, or for something else entirely is not established. The letter suggests he had not yet reached the point of deciding on further steps. He was still in the verification stage, what he needed in order to move beyond that stage, and whether he found it in the 11 weeks between the letter and his death is not known. And if he found it, what happened to that knowledge? This is perhaps the most open question of all, because knowledge, unlike documents, does not leave an automatic trace. If Parr reached some understanding of what he had been pursuing, and if that understanding existed only in his own mind and in materials that have since disappeared from the accessible record, then the knowledge itself may have ended with him, or it may have been passed to someone, through the letter whose recipient cannot be confirmed, through a private conversation that was never written down, through some channel that the surviving evidence does not illuminate. Whether that knowledge survived Parr's death in any recoverable form is a question that 60 years of archival silence has not answered.